On October 13, 1953, at 3:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, CIA Deep Sea Recovery Team Delta 7 made a discovery that would shake the foundations of everything the world believed about World War II. 2 miles beneath the frigid waters of the North Atlantic, they found a Nazi aircraft that should never have existed. Inside the twisted metal wreckage, preserved by the ocean's icy embrace, lay a black box containing recordings that would prove Adolf Hitler never died in that Berlin bunker. The voice on those tapes, speaking with chilling clarity just hours before his supposed suicide, revealed a truth so devastating that it remains classified to this day. "I await a new beginning." Hitler's voice crackled through the static, recorded on April 29, 1945. "Those I leave behind must never learn the truth. I remain alive, but I remain in the shadows. The seeds of the Fourth Reich have already been planted in fertile soil across the ocean. What the world celebrates as my death is merely the first act of our greatest deception." The black box contained 17 minutes and 34 seconds of recordings that would redefine everything historians thought they knew about the end of Nazi Germany. But this was just the beginning of a conspiracy so vast, so carefully orchestrated, that it had fooled the entire world for nearly a decade. The man responsible for the Holocaust had not faced justice. He had simply vanished. Agent Samuel Morrison stood on the deck of the research vessel Poseidon, his hands trembling as he held the preliminary report from the dive team. 23 years old, fresh out of Yale, Morrison had joined the CIA believing he would be fighting communism. He never imagined he would be hunting ghosts from the Third Reich in the depths of the Atlantic Ocean. The coordinates had come from Klaus Richter, a former SS Oberfuhrer who had spent 8 years hiding in the slums of Buenos Aires before his conscience finally drove him to contact American intelligence. Richter's story was so outrageous that 3 different CIA psychiatrists had declared him delusional. Yet here they were, staring at evidence that his impossible tale might be true. "The Frere spoke of action paragraph nix," Richter had whispered during his debriefing, his eyes darting nervously around the safe house in Argentina. "Operation Phoenix." While the Allies celebrated victory, the real Nazi leadership had already escaped through Ratlands established years earlier. Hitler was not the man cornered in a bunker. He was the architect of the greatest deception in human history. Morrison crushed his cigarette beneath his boot as the submersible's lights pierced the darkness 2 miles below. The Poseidon was officially conducting oceanographic research, but its true mission was known only to a handful of men in Washington. Even President Eisenhower had been briefed on this operation, though the official records would later be destroyed to maintain plausible deniability. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell emerged from the communications bay, her face pale in the harsh deck lighting. A brilliant linguist and former OSS operative, Hartwell had been recruited specifically for this mission because of her expertise in Nazi documentation and her security clearance that went beyond top secret. What she had just heard through the radio headset had shaken her to her core. "They've found it," she said, her voice barely audible over the sound of the Atlantic wind. "The aircraft is exactly where Richter said it would be. A Junkers Ju-390, modified for long-range flight. The cargo bay is intact, and they've located what appears to be the flight recorder. But Samuel, there's something else. Something Richter never told us about." Morrison felt ice form in his stomach. Klaus Richter had provided them with dozens of details about Hitler's escape, from the modified aircraft to the precise coordinates where it had gone down during a storm while en route to Argentina. But if there were secrets that even Richter hadn't known about, then this conspiracy was even larger than they had imagined. The Junkers Ju-390 had been one of Nazi Germany's most advanced aircraft, capable of flying from Europe to North America without refueling. Only 2 prototypes had ever been built, and according to official records, both had been destroyed before the war's end. Yet here was evidence of a third aircraft, one that had been secretly constructed for a very specific purpose, ensuring the survival of the Third Reich's leadership. "What did they find?" Morrison asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. The mission had already revealed enough classified information to keep government censors busy for decades. If there were additional complications, it might mean that certain truths would never see the light of day, regardless of their historical significance. Hartwell handed him a transcript of the latest radio communication from the submersible. As Morrison read the typed words, he felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The dive team had discovered not just the black box containing Hitler's final recordings, but also a sealed compartment containing detailed maps of South America, financial records showing massive gold transfers, and photographs that appeared to show Nazi officials in post-war settings. Estimated value of the transferred assets exceeds $200 million in 1945 currency, Morrison read aloud, his voice growing hoarse. Destination: Banco de la República Argentina, with secondary accounts in Chilean and Brazilian institutions. Photographed individuals include Heinrich Müller, Martin Bormann, and at least 12 other high-ranking Nazi officials presumed dead or missing. The implications were staggering. If these documents were authentic, then Operation Phoenix had not been the desperate escape of a few war criminals, but a carefully planned exodus that had preserved both the Nazi leadership and their vast financial resources. The men responsible for the Holocaust had not only escaped justice, but they had done so while taking enough wealth to establish a shadow empire in South America. Morrison's hands shook as he continued reading the dive team's report. Among the recovered materials was a leather portfolio containing what appeared to be architectural blueprints for a large compound in the Argentinian mountains, complete with airstrips, communication facilities, and defensive fortifications. The level of detail suggested that construction had not only been planned, but had likely been completed years earlier. "My God!" Hartwell whispered, reading over Morrison's shoulder. "They weren't just escaping. They were establishing a government in exile. Look at these organizational charts, Samuel. They show a complete Nazi administrative structure, with Hitler at the top and departments for everything from propaganda to weapons development. This isn't the story of war criminals fleeing justice. This is evidence of the Fourth Reich." The radio crackled to life, interrupting their conversation with an urgent transmission from the submersible. "Control, this is Deep 6. We have successfully recovered the black box and accompanying materials, but we've encountered an unexpected complication. The aircraft's cargo bay contains additional sealed containers that appear to have been added after the original construction. We're going to need additional time to catalog everything we found." Morrison grabbed the radio microphone with trembling fingers. "Deep 6, this is Control. What kind of additional containers are we talking about? Can you provide a visual description?" He tried to keep his voice steady, but the implications of the discovery were becoming more terrifying with each new revelation. If there were more secrets hidden in that aircraft, then Operation Phoenix might have been even more extensive than anyone had imagined. The pilot's voice came through the static with barely controlled excitement. "Control, we're looking at approximately 30 sealed metal cases, each about the size of a briefcase. They appear to be waterproof and are marked with Nazi eagle insignia and classification symbols we don't recognize. But that's not the strangest part. There's also what appears to be scientific equipment, including some kind of advanced recording device that's more sophisticated than anything we've seen from that era." Hartwell and Morrison exchanged glances filled with a mixture of fascination and dread. Scientific equipment suggested that the Nazis had been developing technology that was ahead of its time, possibly using knowledge acquired from German scientists who were later recruited by both American and Soviet intelligence agencies. If some of that technology had been preserved in the aircraft, it could represent a significant intelligence coup. "Deep 6, can you provide more details about the recording equipment?" Morrison asked, his mind racing through the possibilities. The black box containing Hitler's final testament was shocking enough. But if the Nazis had been experimenting with advanced recording technology, there might be even more evidence of their post-war activities preserved in those mysterious containers. The submersible pilot's response sent chills through both CIA operatives. "Control, this equipment appears to be designed for long-term surveillance and communication. We're looking at radio transmitters, recording devices, and what might be early television equipment. There are also maps showing locations throughout South America, North America, and Europe, with notations in German that we can't fully translate from down here." Morrison realized that they were looking at evidence of a Nazi intelligence network that had survived the war, and had been actively monitoring Allied activities for years. The implications for national security were enormous. If Hitler and his associates had been receiving intelligence from operatives around the world, then they might know far more about American Cold War activities than anyone had imagined. As the submersible began its ascent with the recovered materials, Morrison found himself wondering if they were making a terrible mistake by bringing this evidence to the surface. Some secrets were so dangerous that they were better left buried in the depths of the ocean. The knowledge that Adolf Hitler had survived the war was shocking enough, but the revelation that he had established a functioning shadow government might be too much for the world to handle. The next 2 hours passed in tense silence, as the dive team made their way back to the surface. Morrison and Hartwell spent the time trying to prepare themselves for what they might find when the sealed containers were opened. Each revelation had been more disturbing than the last, and they both understood that their lives were about to change forever once they examined the full extent of the recovered materials. When the submersible finally broke the surface, the recovery operation began immediately. The CIA had prepared for this moment by equipping the Poseidon with a specialized laboratory capable of handling potentially dangerous or sensitive materials. Morrison watched as the black box and accompanying containers were carefully lifted aboard, each one representing a potential bombshell that could reshape the understanding of modern history. Dr. Hartwell took charge of the preliminary examination, using her expertise in Nazi documentation to assess the materials before they were transported to CIA headquarters for detailed analysis. As she opened the first container, her face went pale. Inside were hundreds of photographs showing Nazi officials in what appeared to be South American settings, along with documents bearing dates from 1946, 1947, and later. "Samuel, you need to see this," Hartwell said, her voice barely steady. "These aren't just escape plans or financial records. These are operational documents showing ongoing Nazi activities years after the war supposedly ended. Look at these photographs. That's Heinrich Himmler standing next to what appears to be a South American government official, and the date stamp shows 1948. Morrison examined the photograph with a magnifying glass, his hands trembling as he recognized the unmistakable face of one of history's most wanted war criminals. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, had supposedly died in British custody in 1945. Yet here was clear evidence that he had not only survived, but had been actively working to rebuild Nazi influence in South America. The documents accompanying the photographs were even more disturbing. They showed evidence of ongoing weapons development, recruitment activities, and financial operations that suggested the Nazi organization had not only survived, but had been growing stronger in the years since the war. The scope of Operation Phoenix was far beyond anything that American intelligence had imagined. As they continued examining the recovered materials, a pattern began to emerge that was more terrifying than either CIA operative had anticipated. The Nazis had not simply fled to South America to hide from justice. They had established what amounted to a government in exile, complete with military capabilities, intelligence networks, and long-term plans for what they called the restoration of the Reich. The most chilling discovery came when Hartwell opened a container filled with detailed maps of the United States, marked with locations of German-American communities, defense installations, and government facilities. The maps were annotated with notes suggesting that Nazi operatives had been conducting surveillance activities on American soil, possibly for years, while maintaining contact with the leadership in South America. "My God, Samuel," Hartwell whispered, spreading the maps across the laboratory table. "They've been watching us. Look at these markings around Washington, D.C., around military bases, around research facilities. This isn't the work of war criminals in hiding. This is evidence of an active intelligence operation directed against the United States government." Morrison felt his world shift as he realized the full implications of their discovery. The Cold War had been fought under the assumption that the primary threat to American security came from the Soviet Union. But if the Nazis had established a functioning shadow government with active intelligence capabilities, then the United States had been fighting a war on two fronts without even knowing it. The black box containing Hitler's final recordings was almost anticlimactic after the revelations contained in the other materials. When they finally played the tapes, Hitler's voice filled the laboratory with chilling clarity, speaking not as a defeated dictator facing death, but as a leader confident in his organization's ability to survive and eventually triumph. The temporary setback in Europe does not signal the end of our cause, Hitler's recorded voice declared with undiminished fanaticism. The foundations of the Fourth Reich have been established in the New World, where we will have time to rebuild our strength and plan our return. The Jewish conspiracy that brought about our temporary defeat will find that reports of our death have been greatly exaggerated. The recordings continued for over 17 minutes, detailing escape routes, financial arrangements, and long-term strategic plans that painted a picture of Nazi survival that was far more organized and extensive than anyone had imagined. Hitler spoke of establishing breeding programs to create a new generation of Nazi leadership, of developing advanced weapons technology, and of infiltrating Allied governments to gather intelligence and influence policy. As the final words of Hitler's testament faded into static, Morrison and Hartwell sat in stunned silence. They had uncovered evidence of what might be the greatest conspiracy in modern history, a deception so vast and so carefully orchestrated that it had fooled the entire world for nearly a decade. The question now was what to do with this knowledge. The decision would ultimately be made at levels far above their security clearance, but Morrison knew that the implications of their discovery would reverberate through the intelligence community for years to come. The Cold War had been predicated on certain assumptions about the post-war world, and those assumptions had just been shattered by the contents of a black box recovered from the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. In the days that followed, as the Poseidon made its way back to port, Morrison and Hartwell would discover that their findings were just the tip of an iceberg that extended far deeper than they had imagined. The Nazi escape network had connections that reached into the highest levels of governments around the world, and the implications for global security were too dangerous to fully comprehend. The black box and its accompanying materials would eventually make their way to the desk of CIA Director Allen Dulles, who would brief President Eisenhower on their contents in a closed-door meeting that would never appear in any official records. The decision to classify the information at the highest levels of secrecy would be made within hours, ensuring that the truth about Hitler's survival would remain hidden from the American people. But secrets have a way of surviving even the most determined efforts to bury them, and the truth about Operation Phoenix would eventually surface in ways that none of the participants could have anticipated. The discovery of that sunken Nazi aircraft was not the end of the story, but merely the beginning of a decades-long effort to uncover the full extent of Nazi survival and the ongoing threat it represented to the free world. As Morrison would later write in his classified memoir, "We went looking for evidence of war criminals, and instead we found proof that the war had never really ended. The Third Reich had not died in the ruins of Berlin. It had simply moved to a new theater of operations, where it continued to pursue its ultimate goals with patience, resources, and a level of organization that would have impressed any intelligence professional. The most terrifying part was not that Hitler had survived, but that his survival was part of a larger plan that was still being executed. But the most terrifying truth wasn't that Hitler had survived. The most terrifying truth was who had helped him do it. These weren't just Nazi fugitives hiding in South America. These were Americans. Your neighbors. Your senators. Your business leaders." Agent Samuel Morrison stared at the photographs spread across the CIA briefing table. Friedrich Kellner smiled back at him from a Georgetown charity gala. The same man who had been secretly funding Nazi operations for 8 years. The same man who sat on the board of 3 major defense contractors. Senator Robert Ashford looked distinguished in his military uniform, accepting a medal for his service in World War II. But the documents proved he had been selling classified military secrets to the same regime he had once fought against. The betrayal ran deeper than anyone could imagine. These people didn't know they were becoming part of a massive conspiracy until the very last moment. Or did they? Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell's voice shook as she read the names aloud. Defense contractors, government officials, academic researchers. The network had been growing for years. The investigation revealed something that made the Atlantic discovery look trivial. The Nazi escape wasn't about war criminals fleeing justice. It was about creating a shadow government that had been operating in America since the war ended. right under everyone's noses. Heinrich Weber wasn't just a Swiss businessman. He was the coordinator of Operation Valkyrie II, the systematic infiltration of American institutions. Every handshake, every business deal, every political favor had been carefully orchestrated from a compound in the Argentine mountains. But the documents revealed something even more disturbing. The American collaborators weren't being blackmailed or coerced. They were volunteers. True believers who had been waiting for this moment since 1945. They wanted the Nazis to return to power. Morrison's hands trembled as he opened the next file. Inside were photographs from a dinner party in Georgetown. Senators, generals, businessmen, all raising their glasses in a toast. But look closer at what's hanging on the wall behind them. Do you see it? A small Nazi flag, barely visible in the shadows. Can you trust a system that deceives even its own agents? Morrison was asking himself this question as he realized his own government had known about some of these connections for years. The CIA had files on Kellner dating back to 1948. Yet nothing had been done. The Nazi organization had studied American society with scientific precision. They knew exactly who to approach, exactly what to offer, exactly how to appeal to people's darkest instincts. The network wasn't built through force. It was built through careful manipulation and shared ideology. When Morrison tried to arrest Heinrich Weber, he discovered the man had diplomatic immunity through the Argentine embassy. The same embassy that had been processing Nazi refugees since the war ended. The same embassy that had been facilitating money transfers from Swiss banks to American accounts. The surveillance recordings from the Georgetown mansion revealed conversations that would haunt Morrison for the rest of his life. These weren't desperate conspirators. These were confident men planning the future of America. A future where Nazi ideology would guide government policy from the shadows. Senator Ashford's voice was clear on the recordings. The American people aren't ready for the truth yet. But when the time comes, when society needs strong leadership, we'll be ready. The seeds have been planted. Now we just need to wait for them to grow. The financial records showed millions of dollars flowing from South America through European banks to American accounts. Money that funded political campaigns, business ventures, research projects. Every dollar had been carefully tracked and directed to maximize Nazi influence in American society. Morrison realized they weren't just investigating a conspiracy. They were uncovering the early stages of a takeover that had been planned for decades. The Nazis hadn't given up after losing the war. They had simply changed their strategy from military conquest to political infiltration. The betrayal among allies ran deeper than anyone could comprehend. When Morrison's own supervisor, Deputy Director Charles Hoffman, appeared in one of the recovered photographs, the young agent realized he could trust no one. The conspiracy reached into the heart of the CIA itself. How do you feel when you discover that everything you believed was a lie? Morrison asked himself this question as he sat alone in his apartment, wondering if he was being watched. The people he had sworn to serve were the same people who were betraying everything America stood for. The Nazi documents outlined a 20-year plan for the restoration of their regime. Phase 1 had been the escape and establishment of the South American base. Phase 2 was the infiltration of Allied governments. Phase 3 would be the gradual takeover of democratic institutions. By 1973, according to their timeline, Nazi ideology would be guiding policy in Washington, London, and Paris. The Holocaust would be forgotten. The war crimes would be rewritten as necessary actions. The victims would be blamed for their own suffering. Morrison discovered that some of the most respected historians and journalists in America were part of the network. They had been slowly reshaping the narrative of World War II, making Nazi actions seem less extreme, making Hitler seem more reasonable, making the Holocaust seem exaggerated. The scientific equipment recovered from the sunken aircraft wasn't just for communication. It was for mind control experiments. The Nazis had been developing psychological manipulation techniques that could influence large populations. Techniques that were being tested on American citizens. Television programs, radio broadcasts, newspaper articles, all carefully crafted to shift public opinion gradually. Most Americans had no idea they were being subjected to sophisticated propaganda designed to make them more accepting of authoritarian ideas. The most shocking discovery came when Morrison found files on Project Mindbridge. American children were being exposed to Nazi ideology through seemingly innocent cultural programs. Summer camps, youth organizations, educational materials, all designed to create a new generation of Nazi sympathizers. These weren't obvious propaganda efforts. They were subtle, sophisticated psychological operations that planted ideas in young minds without the children or their parents realizing what was happening. The next generation was being prepared for the restoration of the Reich. Morrison tried to warn his superiors, but discovered that half of them were already compromised. The Nazi network had been recruiting within the intelligence community for years. The people responsible for protecting America were the same people who were selling it to its enemies. When your own government betrays you, when your colleagues sell you out, when your country's leaders serve foreign masters, the betrayal leaves scars that can never be erased. Morrison learned this lesson the hard way when his investigation was suddenly shut down without explanation. The evidence was classified at levels that made it impossible to prosecute anyone. The photographs disappeared into government vaults. The recordings were declared too sensitive for public release. The financial records were sealed under national security provisions. Morrison realized that the conspiracy wasn't just about Nazi survival. It was about the fundamental transformation of American society. The war hadn't ended in 1945. It had simply moved to a different battlefield, where the weapons were lies, corruption, and betrayal. This moment changed everything. It turned out that the discovery of Hitler's survival was just the beginning of an even larger conspiracy. Morrison and his team were merely pawns in a game that had been playing out for decades, with stakes higher than anyone had imagined. The Nazi organization hadn't just escaped to South America. They had established a parallel government that was slowly taking control of democratic institutions around the world. Every election, every policy decision, every cultural shift was being influenced by Nazi operatives working in the shadows. Morrison discovered that some of America's most trusted allies were part of the conspiracy. NATO officials, European leaders, international business leaders, all working together to gradually transform Western civilization according to Nazi ideology. The scope of the deception was breathtaking. Wars had been started and ended to serve Nazi interests. Economic policies had been implemented to funnel wealth to their operations. Social movements had been manipulated to create division and chaos that would make people desperate for strong leadership. What do we really know? What remains beyond the limits of our understanding? These were the questions that haunted Morrison as he realized the investigation had only scratched the surface of a conspiracy that spanned continents and decades. The Nazi documents spoke of a final solution that had nothing to do with the Holocaust. It was their plan for the complete restructuring of human civilization, with themselves as the master race ruling over a world population reduced to slavery. Morrison tried to go public with his discoveries, but found that every journalist, every publisher, every media outlet he contacted was either part of the conspiracy or too frightened to report the truth. The Nazi network controlled information as effectively as they controlled money and politics. The young CIA agent realized that he was fighting a war that had already been lost. The enemy had won not through military conquest, but through patience, planning, and the systematic corruption of everything Americans held sacred. When Morrison tried to flee the country with copies of the evidence, he discovered that his passport had been revoked and his bank accounts frozen. The same government that had sent him to investigate the Nazi conspiracy was now treating him as a traitor for uncovering the truth. The betrayal was complete. The system that had promised to protect democracy was actually working to destroy it. The people who claimed to serve America were actually serving its enemies. Everything Morrison had believed about his country was a carefully constructed lie. In the end, Morrison disappeared. Some say he was killed by Nazi agents. Others believe he was imprisoned by his own government. The truth is that he became another casualty in a war that most people don't even know is being fought. We now know that the entire story we've been told about the post-war world may be nothing more than a false narrative. The good guys didn't win World War II. They just convinced us that they had. The real war continued in secret, and the wrong side has been winning. The evidence Morrison discovered should have changed everything. Instead, it was buried so deep that most people will never learn the truth. The Nazi conspiracy succeeded not because they were stronger than democracy, but because they were more patient and more cunning. This is why we must question everything we think we know about history. This is why we must be suspicious of official narratives and government explanations. Because the people in power may not be who they claim to be, and their loyalty may not be to the countries they claim to serve. The story of Operation Phoenix proves that the most dangerous enemies are not the ones who attack openly, but the ones who smile while they stab you in the back. The ones who gain your trust while they plan your destruction. The ones who convince you they're your friends while they're actually your conquerors. What happened to Agent Morrison reminds us that truth is more dangerous than fiction, and that some secrets are so explosive that revealing them can cost you everything. But the truth must be told, even if those in power don't want us to know it. The Nazi conspiracy didn't end with Hitler's supposed death. It evolved, adapted, and grew stronger. Today, their descendants may be walking among us, holding positions of power, making decisions that affect millions of lives, all while serving masters whose names we'll never know. This is the reality of the world we live in. A world where nothing is as it seems, where history is written by the winners, and where the most important truths are the ones they don't want you to discover. The question is, what are you going to do with this knowledge?